Let's have a little talk about the global warming scare and climate models and climate modelling and all these scientists who, let's face it, they keep getting it wrong. Now, the computer models really matter because the whole global warming scare is based on what these various models say will happen if CO2 adds some extra heating. Now, everyone accepts that on its own that CO2 will only add a small amount of heating over the next century, even if there are no controls or reductions in emissions. But the computer models say this little bit of heating will trigger various other mechanisms that will push temperatures much higher in a spiral of destruction. They say that there is some sort of dangerous tipping point. However, the problem is that the latest data has shown these models to be very wrong. Even the modelers accept the new data and accept that the previous models are wrong, but they don't seem to be able to come up with anything that's right. There's a number of things that the models actually get wrong. One of them is when the IPCC climate model was first introduced, to make it line up with historical results, a fiddle factor was added, which basically resulted in the effects of carbon dioxide being multiplied by a factor of almost 3. Now, there was no real justification for this. It was just done to make the models line up with historical data. But what it has done is it has resulted in these models being far too sensitive to carbon dioxide. Now, this is fine for various politicians and industrialists who make lots of money from shoving theoretical carbon emissions around, but it's not so good for the rest of us as we see spiralling energy costs. The world basically continues its dive towards hell. That's just one thing that's wrong. Another thing that's wrong is that the old temperature measurements themselves are wrong. They show warming, which didn't actually occur. Well, it occurred locally in some areas. The reason that this happened is that when these temperature survey stations were originally set up, they were well away from the towns and cities, but as the decades went past and the towns and cities grew larger, suddenly these temperature measuring stations found themselves in the middle of an urban area. And on average, yes, an urban area is going to be 5 to 10 degrees centigrade, depending on where you are in the world, warmer than a rural area. So you've got, if you like, this false warming effect on some of the historical data. Now, the next thing they go and ignore is the effect of clouds. Any effect of water vapour in the air is not in the model. And there's good reasons for this. It's impossible to predict cloud cover and cloud movements with any certainty. And that has a major effect on how much energy from the sun actually gets to the earth. Because obviously a cloud reflects a lot more heat back than a clear sky. So the sun will deliver more energy on a clear day, as we know. We go out sunbathing. But clouds also have the opposite effect sometimes. They'll trap heat in at night. Now, scientists kind of thought, oh well, the two things cancel each other out, but do they? Results from new satellites put up by NASA suggest that in fact they don't cancel out. That the amount of heat that the clouds reflect is very, very important. So there's another place where the models all fall down, and it's one that can't be fixed, by the way. The next thing the models ignore is the effect of methane. Methane has got 5 times the effect of carbon dioxide when it comes to greenhouse gas problems, and nobody really disputes that, but the amount of methane in the atmosphere varies enormously from time to time. And it's not just because all of the flatulence of McDonald's cows in South America. There's natural sources of methane on the seabed, and when there's an earthquake or something like that, this methane gets released in bubbles in the ocean, drifts up into the atmosphere, and whack, suddenly you've got a large increase of methane, maybe only in a local area, a few thousand miles wide, but it's still a big increase and it has a big effect. And the final thing that they don't figure in, because they can't really do anything about it. The final thing is volcanic dust. Now, just recently we've had one heck of a lot of volcanoes erupting. You may remember the Iceland eruptions that caused aircraft to be grounded because of all the fine dust in the upper atmosphere. Well, guess what? That fine dust reflects sunlight, and it stops a proportion of sunlight coming down, reduces the amount of energy that reaches the Earth and causes cooling. The models cannot take this into account because they don't know when the volcanoes are going to erupt. In fact, if there's another super volcano at Yellowstone, we might see the sun's heating power reduced by 20% for 6 months or more. We'd be into a situation then similar to nuclear winter. And obviously these sort of things the climate models cannot predict, yet they do happen. Now, there is some discussion as to how variable our sun has been. We know historically, if we look into the records of sunspots that have been kept by astronomers even in the days before telescopes, that on years when there's very few sunspots, very low solar activity, it tends to be colder. In fact, there was a little ice age in the 16th century when people were actually skating on the River Thames in London for half the year. And that seems to have been caused by a lack of sunspots and a lack of output from the sun. Possibly also because there was a large volcano on the other side of the world. It's possible that also that contributed. So we can't really trust climate scientists, even if they're honest, which they don't seem to be, judging by all the scandals there are about rigged data and so on and so forth. And we definitely can't trust climate science that's being paid for by people who have a vested interest in making us scared, in making us think that unless we pay Al Gore billions of dollars in carbon taxes, and the world is going to heat up and heat up and heat up, and we're all going to slowly roast. Well, I'm sorry ladies and gentlemen, but that isn't going to happen. Not that I think many of you want it to, but I think there's some industrialists and politicians and ex-politicians who would like us to think that this is exactly what is going to happen. So at the end of the day, there's really no need to worry about global warming. Yes, worry about pollution, worry about chemicals getting into the environment, worry about the thing that they don't want you to worry about at the moment, which is radiation from Fukushima. Worry like heck about that. But don't worry about global warming, because global warming, if it does happen, won't be anything to do with man's activities. It'll be more to do with the fact that the output from the sun's gone up, or some other factor, because our activities have something like 0.5% input. 0.5%. Just think about that. It's negligible. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, and that it's put some of your fears to rest. If it has, please like and subscribe. Thanks very much. See you soon.